For especially those folks that are in California, we have 2 cooperative extension specialists in California. So I'm in the School of Vet Med, focus more on infectious diseases, and Dr. Blatchford is in the Animal Science Department and focuses on welfare and behavior. And the one thing I'll tell you about welfare and behavior that took me several years to really recognize is that welfare and behavior really does stretch into biosecurity and food safety and production and marketing and all the things that we're concerned about and interested in. It really does have applications in all those areas. So I think to think of it as a standalone issue is probably being a little closed-minded, and took me a little while to realize that, but it's an extremely important field. And UC Davis is probably, not probably, I think Dr. Blatchford can comment on this, but probably the global leader when it comes to just pure numbers of faculty resources that are focused on animal welfare in general. Thank you, Dr. Blatchford.
Thanks for coming today. Thanks for everyone who is online. So as Dr. Proteski mentioned, I'm in the Animal Science Department here at UC Davis. My sort of research interests are husbandry, behavior, and welfare of poultry. And so I'm really interested in trying to understand the way that we house birds and things that we do management technique-wise. How does that affect the birds from the bird's perspective? More so than sort of how we perceive it's happening. So I will kind of give ourselves a bit of a pat on the back today. As Dr. Proteski alluded to, we do have the largest animal welfare group of researchers in a single department here at Davis. So you have to have that single department disclaimer. But it's a great place to be, and hopefully you'll learn something today about animal welfare. There we go. So I wanted to start out really sort of trying to understand what is animal welfare. It's this sort of global term that we all use, but what does it actually mean? I was actually on part of an audience member of a webinar earlier today where they were defining animal wellness, and they defined it as animal welfare, health, and environment. And I was thinking, but that's animal welfare. You can't define it with it. So it's a little bit of a nebulous term, but essentially when we think about animal welfare, we're thinking about these sort of 3 different areas and how they interact with each other. And this is true for any species of animal that you're studying. So there are these 3 basic approaches to animal welfare. The sort of one that I'm most connected to is the behavioral approach. So we try to understand things like abnormal behaviors. Why are animals behaving in an abnormal kind of way? Animal preferences. So what do they prefer if you give them different options? There's also physiology and health. So this is thinking more from sort of a veterinary perspective. These are going to look at things like stress hormones, growth and reproduction, disease states. And then we have the mind approach or affective state approach. And that's really trying to get at what's happening in the perception of the animal. So is the animal in pain? Is it suffering in some kind of way? Is it experiencing a positive or a negative emotional state? And we can look at that through some different cognition tests, trying to understand consciousness in animals. Obviously, that's a much more difficult route to take, but it's maybe the most important in terms of animal welfare, because how we perceive something really is going to dictate what kind of state we're in, whether it's positive or negative. So with that being said, there are a number of sort of animal self-interests that we need to be aware of when we talk about animal welfare. And what does it mean when I start talking about animal welfare science? So I listed a couple examples here of what we would think of as animal self-interest. So they're going to be doing things, whether consciously or not, to avoid pain. They're going to be doing things to have the ability to experience some kind of emotion, whether that's positive or negative, and so on here, including relationship to humans. So how are they interacting with people? Do they want to interact? Is it a positive experience for them? And as people were starting to explore these ideas, they really discovered that there was no way to sort of assess these self-interests in animals. And so animal welfare science, in part, became a science in an attempt to try to answer these questions in an objective kind of way. And we'll talk about that term objective in a moment. So I wanted to pose a question because, as you can imagine, those are really complicated kind of ideas to try to answer, and those are the ones that we're, as animal welfare scientists, very interested in answering. But the question we get asked most often is a question like this. Which of these housing systems is better for the animal? Which provides better welfare? So I just want to take a straw poll. How many of you think the conventional cage housing is probably the best? And I was really glad that Dr. Bland was coming today because I knew you'd raise your hand for that. Excellent. And how many think something more around this free-range pasture-based system is better for the animal's welfare? Okay, so some maybes, probably. So the answer is really difficult, and I will say that neither one of you is correct and neither one of you is wrong. And if you ask me this question, I'm going to give you a really long, convoluted answer about pros and cons of every system and risk factors and all these sorts of things. I'm never going to actually answer that question for you. I'll provide you with information and you will have to answer it yourself. But I did just want to point out the reason why there are these discrepancies when we're looking at data from animal welfare studies is because animal welfare as a science is actually an ethics-based science. So when you're interpreting results or risk factors or pros and cons, what you feel as an individual is potentially better than something else. It's going to fall back on whatever ethical viewpoint you follow. And also sort of where your biases lie on those approaches to studying animal welfare. So if I were looking at this, I would say, okay, behavior is really important because I'm biased towards behavior. That's where my training is. And behavioral expression is what's most, we'll say, is what's most important. Whereas if you talk to someone like Dr. Bland, who's trained in veterinary medicine, health and that physiological state and disease state is probably the most important, which is why he would lean more towards our conventional cage system because it's much easier to control disease and keep the animals healthy in that type of environment. But they don't have a lot of behavioral freedom. So you kind of have to weigh all these pros and cons, and ultimately where each individual lands on that depends on what your ethical approach is. And there are lots of different ethical approaches that you can take. So I'm just going to kind of lay out some of the issues, welfare issues that we know exist. Some of them exist across all housing types of systems. I'm going to try to focus more on the cage-free. We don't have a lot of data on free-range and pasture systems, so most of our cage-free data is going to come from something like an aviary system or a really big indoor system. So I've tried to, where we know that there are some issues, I've tried to point those out in the sort of more small-scale type production systems. Okay, so first we're going to start with laying hens. I wasn't sure how many of you would be interested in egg production versus meat production, so we'll go through both of them today, and we'll start with laying hens. So here are a few of the major welfare issues that we know are associated with laying hens, and in particular, these smaller scale extensive systems. And I'll go in depth with a few of these as we go through. So foot condition is one, foot health, skeletal disorders, behavioral management. That's one that's especially important for cage-free systems, no matter what kind of cage-free system you have. Health and predation. I'm not really going to go into a lot of in-depth health issues, but I will say that anytime you have birds outdoors, predation is a major welfare issue. It's a major cause of mortality. I will just say that I think predation would be a really bad way to go, being a little bit anthropomorphic here. But for a lot of people, if you have a customer base that's really interested in these type of systems, a lot of times they're okay with predation because they sort of consider a more natural form of death. So again, think back to those ethical, where they're approaching from an ethical viewpoint, that sort of natural lifestyle is much more important to them. And then while not a direct welfare issue for birds themselves, when you talk about cage-free egg production, there's a lot of consumer confusion about what exactly that means. There's a lot of researcher confusion about what all that means sometimes as well. I'm one of those weirdos. You might see me in a supermarket lurking near the egg aisle. And I'm really just interested in how people make decisions about what product they're buying or not. So I just kind of lurk and watch. And there's always new labels popping up that I've not seen before either. So I think it's really interesting to try to see, okay, who's producing this? What does this actually mean? But you may get a lot of questions about this. And it seems, when I talk to people, it seems like when consumers figure out that cage-free does not mean what this picture is showing, they get a little bit upset and like, this was false advertisement. But cage-free as a label itself was not meant to convey this particular type of housing system. Okay, foot condition. Foot condition is an issue that runs the gamut across any kind of housing system. So from the most intensive cage production system through to the most extensive cage-free production system, you're going to potentially see foot problems. And when we talk about foot health, there are three major types of health issues that we typically think about with foot health. So here in the upper, let's see on your screen, I think it's the upper left, is a normal toe. You can see some of the scaling on the underside of the foot. That's what it should look like. The nail's probably a little bit long, but that's okay. Underneath that is a condition called hyperkeratosis. And hyperkeratosis is very similar to calluses that we would get on our fingers. It's not considered painful in and of itself, but as you can see in this photo, some of the scales have become elongated, and that makes them prone to becoming ripped off if they're on a rough surface, or particularly on a wire floor. And then you can get injury to the toe, you can get infection and disease. And so secondary causes can cause some pain. Probably considered one of the least foot issues when we talk about these three. The sort of middle issue would be something called pododermatitis, or you may have heard it referred to as foot pad dermatitis. It's the same thing. And essentially here you get a lesion on the foot, it becomes infected. You can get swelling of the foot. It can be painful, though not always. And it does typically self-reside, so it will eventually heal and go away. You can, well, I'll hold off on that for a moment. Really severe pododermatitis can cover the entire bottom of the foot. But typically you'd see sort of this circular black cork region somewhere on the pad of the foot, and that's pretty indicative of foot pad dermatitis. The most severe type of foot lesion would be bumblefoot. Again, an infection of the foot, it usually causes a lot of swelling. Birds, it's very painful. Birds tend to be very hesitant to put weight on their foot, especially if they had, this is a pretty severe bumblefoot condition. Oftentimes it will heal, they will heal on their own as well. You typically will see scarring. After that, you can treat them. You can talk to your veterinarian. It's very labor intensive. To do that, it's not generally recommended unless it's a pet bird, I would think. But you want to see very few of those bumblefoot issues. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about housing systems in general, just as a comparator. A few studies have been done looking at incidence and occurrence of these different types of foot lesions in commercial birds. And in some of the studies, they found about 60% of hens kept in cages had hyperkeratosis, but they could decrease that to about 3% by changing the flooring of the cage. So instead of just plain wire, they put plastic coated wire and a low slope. And there's a slope on the floor so that the eggs will roll out to the front of the cage to an egg belt. So here you can change that. So you can do modifications to the environment to help foot condition. When we've looked at hens in furnished cages, or here in the US, we typically call them enriched colony cages, or in small group systems, more than 86% of birds showed foot pad disease, and about 7% of those were severe. So that would be the bumblefoot condition. So even outside of that sort of conventional cage system, we still see quite a lot of foot issues. And overall, some studies have found 4 times as many hens in non-cage systems had poor foot condition as compared to those in furnished or enriched colony cages. So it seems the more you go away from very intensive agriculture, the more foot issues you tend to see and the more severe foot issues you see. And that has a lot to do with what the birds are actually standing on. So in cage conditions, birds' manure falls through the bottom of the cage, most of it does, and is removed from the system. The more extensive you get, the more that bird is in contact with their manure, so they're standing on their manure. In cage-free systems, oftentimes the litter area within a barn is comprised mostly of manure. Again, they're walking on the ground, their feet are getting wet. What's in manure? Bacteria, much more prone to infection. So that's why we tend to see this happen. Even in furnished cages, there are more flat surfaces for the birds to defecate on. And so again, they're more in contact with their manure on their feet than in conventional cage systems. So we tend to see these more severe foot issues, infection-related issues. In terms of skeletal disorders, you may or may not be aware, but hens, particularly commercial strain hens, tend to develop osteoporosis. Used to be known more frequently as cage layer fatigue. Again, it doesn't really matter what housing system they're in. They're sort of genetically predisposed to developing this condition. The more you go into heritage breeds, likely the less you'll see of osteoporosis, but they'll also live longer, so you may see other skeletal disorders pop up. Keel bone damage. Just curious in the audience, how many of you have heard of keel bone damage as an issue? All right, more than I thought. So for those who don't know, here is the keel bone, and that doesn't show up in the room. So keel bone is this big bone right here. It is the bone where the flight muscles attach to, so breast muscles are attached to that bone. When Europe banned battery cages in 2012, researchers started to discover that there were a lot of birds in these alternative housing systems that had some sort of keel bone damage, a fracture or a deviation. And they were discovering commercially that up to 80 to 90% of the birds in a flock were having these issues. And that's something that we didn't really see before. They do occur in conventional cages, but at much lower rates. Less than 10% of a flock would have these issues. And so the question became, okay, this is really weird. Why are we suddenly seeing all of these keel bone problems? And so it's sort of a hot topic right now in animal welfare, particularly with cage-free housing systems, in laying hens and trying to understand what is it about that environment that makes these birds so prone to have fractures. You also will hear it talked a lot about as a welfare concern. But I will say, because you're getting me, and this is my own particular viewpoint, we don't actually know if they're a welfare concern or not. Presumably, a fracture is going to hurt when it occurs, but the keel bone is actually very cartilaginous, and it doesn't ossify even completely by 40 weeks of age. There's still a small bit that's still ossifying at that point in time. So it could be something that, like we break our nose. It's painful. There's a lot of cartilage in our nose. Once it heals, it's fine. Even if you have a deviation, most people don't report pain associated with that fracture once it's healed. We have found that in some studies now, Some fractures heal very quickly, some fractures do not, so they seem to be a chronic issue. Sometimes it's a very major fracture that can heal very fast, and sometimes it's a very minor fracture, a hairline fracture that just doesn't ever heal through the life of the bird. So potentially it could have some chronic pain associated with it, but there are very few studies that have actually attempted to look at pain in relation to keel bone issues. And one of the reasons that is because we don't have good technology for actually assessing keel bone damage on live birds. So obviously you could do an x-ray, but most people don't have an x-ray that they can bring into a barn and x-ray a whole bunch of birds. So we use a technique called palpation, where you basically just feel with your fingers for a fracture. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. Palpation is notoriously a bad technique. There's very little reliability between different assessors. And one of the other problems is that fractures occur on the bone where you can't actually feel it from outside the bird. So the only way to accurately know if there's a fracture or not is to dissect the bone out of the bird. Obviously, once you've done that, the bird's dead. So not so good on a commercial scale. One of the sort of interesting things we also see is that when we look at alternative housing systems, we tend to see more broken legs. And that likely has to do with just when we move birds into alternative housing systems, we tend to give them more complex environments. And so there's more things that they can bump into, they can crash into. They're not particularly good at navigating space, especially vertical space in flight. And so they tend to crash a lot, or they jump from very high places. And so you tend to see more bone breakage. I wanted to bring up some behavioral management considerations because this is something that I get asked about a lot. So I kind of went through some of my past emails and pulled out some of the more common type behavioral management related questions that I get. So probably the #1 question I get is about range use and how do I get my birds to actually go use the range? And this is true for both free range and pasture. So if you notice in the lower photograph, do you see grass in this picture? No. And that's really common. If you took an aerial photo of most free range and pasture systems, right around the building or the coop, there's almost always a dirt area. And then you see nice lush vegetation, which seems equidistant around the entire area. And that's because birds don't actually really like going out into open space. They're a highly preyed upon animal. It seems like everything wants to eat chickens, including us. And so they like to stay in shelter. We don't typically provide them with a lot of shelter on range, except for either their housing or a mobile coop type system. And even in the pasture photograph, you can kind of see that there's a dirt pad right around the base of the mobile coop. So one of the things that you can do is provide areas of shelter or some kind of incentive for the bird to go out into that range. So in the pasture photo, you can see that they've put feed and water quite a distance away from the mobile coop. And hopefully that will encourage birds to move away from their coop area and out onto pasture and then do some foraging around on their way back. Shade structures work really well, so you can have multiple small shade structures that are fairly portable. People have put up, I've seen brush piles. If you have kind of weedy bush, or you could plant some small trees that provide cover, that might also incentivize birds to move out. Dr. Bland is shaking his head no feverishly at me.
Purchase for box.
I was gonna get there. The downside is that by providing more cover for your birds, you provide more cover for predators also. So you have to do a little bit of a give and take there and a risk analysis in what's worth what for you. I get several questions about, I let my birds out onto pasture, now they won't go back into the coop at night. I have to go out and try to wrangle them and put them all back in. That's fine after dark. Birds don't move too much after dark, but you have to find them after dark, and we don't see very well in the dark, so that sometimes is a little bit of an issue. There's not really a good answer for that except training. Even if you have a mobile coop, keeping them locked inside, at least for a couple of days, maybe up to a week, if necessary, really gets the birds to learn, this is my roosting area. This is where I'm supposed to be at night. And oftentimes we'll then drive the birds to go, they'll go back in. So they're very loyal to roosting areas at night. If you provide them with other places, so if you have, I've seen a few places that have shade structures that provide perching underneath the shade structure. If you provide them with an area that's more preferred for roosting at night, they will go there. So if you have them near your house and you have a porch with eaves, oftentimes they look for the highest place that they can get to, and they will leave that coop area and they will come and perch on your porch. And if any of you have experience with chickens, they poop a lot at night. So you have a very nice, lovely porch in the morning. So keeping their roosting area really in that spot where you want them to go at night and getting them trained to that is really what the best advice I would have for that. One of the things you really want to think about is stocking density. So aggression and cannibalism is something that comes up a lot in these types of alternative housing systems. Stocking density, if it's too crowded, will cause aggression and potentially cannibalism outbreaks within your flock. A lot of people think, okay, well, my birds have access to, an acre of pasture. How is it too crowded? You want to think about stocking density both inside and outside. So don't consider outside as part of your stocking density area, because at night, your birds are going to be inside. If there's a disease outbreak, you may want to shelter your birds inside. Inclement weather, here if it's very stormy, but if you're in the northern Midwest, maybe it's very cold, it's very snowy, your birds aren't going to go outside. They're going to stay inside. And if your stocking density is too high on the inside because you were accounting for outside space as well, you're going to run into problems. So make sure that you have enough space for the birds. We would usually recommend about 144 square inches per bird. So that's a square foot per bird, or more if you can do that. Perching, so you want to make sure you have enough perching for all of the birds to perch at once. So they will perch communally at night. You can get a lot of aggression occurring during that period, especially when they're transitioning up into the perching at night. Perch height can be related to social status with the birds. So the more dominant an individual is, the better perch space it gets access to. So it's going to go to the highest perch space. So if you can give access to perching that's not stratified vertically, so all on one plane, you can help reduce aggression that way. You also want to make sure that your perching, if you have multiple rows of perching, they're at least 12 inches apart. Because you want to make sure that when the birds are perched, they can't reach over and peck at another individual. You can get a lot of vent pecking at that point. Nest boxes, again, you want to make sure they're not crowded. So you can have two different kinds of nest boxes. You can have colony nest boxes, which are designed for multiple birds to nest in at one time, or what we would call individual nest boxes. Unfortunately, birds are very social nesters. And so even though you have individual nest boxes, oftentimes you get a lot of eggs in one box because they all like, for whatever reason, they've all picked that one box as their favorite box to lay in. We would typically recommend for individual boxes, one box for every 5 to 6 hens. Otherwise, you can run into crowding issues again. If they're hanging out together, not really doing much except wanting to lay an egg and feeling a little bit aggressive, you can end up with pecking issues at that point too. There's not much else for them to do in a nest box, so they just start picking at each other. So crowding, make sure your birds aren't crowded. And they will let you know if they feel crowded. You'll start noticing injury, you'll start seeing pecking. So just be aware of that. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a switch and talk about broiler chickens. So for anyone who doesn't know, broiler chickens are the kind of chickens that we produce for meat. They have sort of a plethora of welfare issues when we talk about our modern fast-growing strains. And a lot of them are related to the fast growth rate. So I'll pick a couple of them apart. So we'll talk a little bit about lameness, litter quality, well, actually I should have taken lighting out. I took lighting out for the sake of time. So we won't talk about lighting today. I think stocking density is still in there, and then fast growth. So lameness. A lot of broiler chickens, of our broiler chickens that we raise today, show up with some kind of lameness. And we found that there is a generic link between greater mass and greater lameness. So the heavier the birds are, the more lame they tend to be. And there's this idea of activity. So our modern day broiler chickens are very inactive birds. When they're ready for slaughter, they're spending 80–85% of their time just sitting. And so there's been this idea that if we can get our birds to be more active, we can solve lameness. Don't believe that. There's never actually been a causal link discovered between activity and lameness. So they may not actually be connected. It's probably more a function of weight and their fast growth. And I like to separate lameness into two categories. One that's related to pathology reasons and one that's related to conformation reasons. And that's because there are different welfare issues associated with those. So here are two fairly common pathology related issues. So femoral necrosis, you can see some on that femur there. It's a little bit blurry, but there's kind of a darker red pitted area on the head of the femur. That's the necrotic area. We know that this is a painful condition for birds, and birds that have femoral necrosis tend not to want to move. So it's very difficult to get them up and walking in a house. And then we have tibial dyschondroplasia. And this is basically just cartilage growing out of control. So for those of you online, here's a set of normal tibia, and here's a set of tibial dyschondroplasia, basically, and I'll point here in the room because it doesn't show up. So normal, and the other set is tibial dyschondroplasia. That's all cartilage that was at the head of a bone. This is not necessarily considered painful in and of itself, but it can make it very difficult for the birds to walk. The cartilage mass can make the bones a little bit weak, so they can be prone to fracture as well. And then conformation, I'm sure anyone who has spent time with any number of broiler chickens has eventually seen a conformation issue or a twisted leg. So I have an example here where you can actually see the bone twisted itself, and then that's sort of what it would look like in a live bird. These also conformational issues aren't considered painful in and of themselves, but they can make it difficult for birds to walk. So if you have a particularly crowded house, they might have difficulty accessing feed and water if they have to walk any distance or navigate through other birds to get there. Okay, so how do you know if your birds are lame? What do you do? Essentially, we typically will assess lameness by doing something called gait scoring. And it's looking at what is the gait of the bird and how sort of normal or healthy is that gait. It's a fairly subjective assessment of their walking ability, but it's relatively easy to learn. The only condition is that you should really be familiar with what a normal gait looks like. So you need to have that comparator to score anything that's abnormal. And here, I just have a reference to a system that we use here at Davis called a modified gait scoring system. This system actually came out of Davis a number of years ago. And it attempts to make it a more objective measure by adding time criteria. So it's not just you looking and saying, oh, I think there's a lymph over here. There's some time criteria built in. So the bird must move within 10 seconds or it's whatever score. Anyway, if you're interested in that scoring system, I'm more than happy to talk offline about that, send you the references. Again, very easy system to learn. Litter quality. So litter quality is really important, especially for leg and foot health. There are both environmental impacts and animal impacts of litter quality. So your litter quality is going to determine how much dust is moved around within a house. So if your litter is really dry, if the birds are moving, they're going to kick up a lot of dust in that house. Humidity is also an impact. So really high humidity areas, you're going to have wetter litter. Wetter litter tends to be associated with higher ammonia in the litter. Also very dirty litter, so lots of manure is going to have higher ammonia. Ammonia in your litter is really bad. One, it can cause respiratory issues, both for the birds and for the people working. If you've ever walked into a poultry house that has high ammonia levels, it's very unpleasant. We are actually really good, humans are really good detectors of ammonia. So just by smell, we can detect about 25 parts per million, which is usually a regulatory cutoff. When we walk in the house, that's when you can sort of start to smell it. It might be a little bit burning in your nose. You want to make sure if you're interested in ammonia levels that you're measuring at bird level, because ammonia levels tend to be higher the closer you are to the source. And the source in this case would be manure. So you want to make sure you're at bird level. So as I said, broiler chickens like to sit a lot. They like to rest. And so they have different parts of their body that are in contact with that litter for a longer period of time. So you can get things like hawk burns, foot pad dermatitis, same as with the laying hens. Broiler chickens can get that as well. So if they're in contact with high ammonia levels in the litter, that can also be a way to introduce pathogens and infection. Okay. So what affects litter quality? And this is just obviously not exhaustive, but just a brief overview. The type of substrate you have, so you want something that's absorbent. You want it to absorb the moisture, but not too much moisture because you don't want very dry litter either. Nutrition of the birds, so that can change the content, water content of the manure, which can then change the wetness of your litter. Ventilation, so you want enough ventilation that you're taking ammonia out of the house. If the birds are outside primarily, that's generally not an issue. You'd have natural ventilation. And then water supply. So check your water supply regularly. If it's leaking, it's going to cause a lot of wet litter and you're going to be in trouble. Even if they're outside, if it creates a very muddy area, you can have the same sort of issues happen as with litter. So daily inspections, prompt removal of anything that's wet. Yeah. So I mentioned these earlier. This is just to show you what these actually look like. So here I have an example of some hawk burns. These are fairly mild hawk burns. And then another example of foot pad dermatitis. So you can see that large black area on the bottom of the foot. That's sort of the core of the infection. Fast growth. So I mentioned that fast growth is really a sort of underlying cause of a lot of welfare issues that our modern day broilers have. I do like to point out, because I think that this is a misconception among a lot of consumers, so if you have people who are buying that are concerned about this, the growth rate of modern day broiler chickens has all been done through artificial genetic selection. Not genetic modification, just good old fashioned, these birds grew faster and bigger, we're gonna breed them together, your offspring grow faster and bigger, you pick the best ones out of that batch, breed them together. Hormones in the US are illegal to use to supplement hormones in poultry. Antibiotic use can promote growth, but we're basically moving away from that in general, and likely not something that small producers are likely to use anyway. I do like to show this picture. It's a little bit blurry, but it gives you a sense of just how fast modern day broiler chickens can grow. So prior to World War II, we didn't have these birds. So they're a relatively new type of production animal. The first bird that you see that looks like a young chick is a broiler chicken that was at slaughter size in 1957. And then we have a bird, intermediate bird from 1970, I think that says 8. And then the large bird, 2005. So that's even an old bird for today's standards. So we now grow birds in about 6 weeks, what it would have taken 12 to 15 weeks originally to get them to grow the size up. So they grow really, really fast. So it's not surprising that there are some issues that come along with that. I will also point out here, the reason why we have the type of bird we have today is because of consumer demand. So consumers asked for the particular attributes that we have today. We didn't just wake up one day and say, we want to make a mega bird that has all these weird chickeny things about it. It was created for a particular reason. That being said, there is now a sort of movement in the US to try to get away from that fast growing. So the idea is that if we go back to slower growing animals, that we can eliminate a lot of those welfare issues that are associated with fast growth. So you may or may not have heard, Whole Foods sort of started this trend. They are requiring all of their producers and all the birds sold in their stores to be this slow growing broiler chicken sometime in the next 8 years. However, here are some examples. They're not feed efficient as our fast growing birds. They typically have less or poor breast yield, which is a cut that is particularly enjoyed by the American consumer. They're generally more expensive because there are fewer of them. It costs more to produce them in general. And they're typically colored birds. You may have noticed the broiler chickens, all the pictures I showed you before, they were all white. Slower growing breeds tend to be colored. There are some genetic lines. So some of the genetic companies are creating slow growing birds. So here are a couple examples of those. Or people have gotten really interested in heritage breeds as well. So this naked neck, or sometimes referred to as a Turkin, is one of the breeds that I see pop up a lot in terms of one that people are using for meat production. The reason I bring up colored isn't necessarily a welfare issue, but it's a carcass quality issue. So we have white birds, really just because people don't like seeing pigment on the skin of a cooked chicken, or they don't like seeing the tiny little pin feathers that might be left. And in a white feathered bird, you don't get skin pigment, and any tiny little pin feathers that are left turn translucent when you're cooking them. So you don't really notice that as much. So I think it's interesting that we're sort of, some segment of the population is switching over to having that pigment and feather issue on the bird not be an issue anymore. So what do we know about slow growing broilers? There have been a couple larger scale studies done that have basically looked at environmental impact of these birds. So I have a couple facts out of the studies that have been done. So these birds live longer. How much longer depends on how slower they grow. But essentially, they require additional feed. So enough to fill 670,000 more tractor trailers of feed than if you looked at a comparable number of birds of fast growing. Additional land, so you have more birds, you need more land. You need more land to produce the food that the birds eat. So in these studies, they found that you'd need about 7.6 million acres more just for extra feed. And that's just to give you a comparator, that's about the size of the state of Maryland. In terms of the amount of manure, 28.5 billion pounds more manure produced, and obviously stays at the farm longer. Lots more water needed to produce these birds, so 5.1 billion gallons more water per year. And that's not counting the amount of extra water needed to irrigate the feed crops. And it's been estimated that there'll be an additional cost to the industry of about $9 billion. So I mentioned that these birds were originally being pushed because they supposedly have better welfare outcomes. So did I mention anything about welfare outcomes of slow-growing birds? No, because we have no idea. Nobody has actually looked to see if they have similar welfare issues, if they have fewer welfare issues, if they have their own different welfare issues. We don't know that. There is currently a study happening in Canada, but it's looking on an experimental scale. So it's using university facilities, not commercial farms. But they are looking at a number of different slow growing strains to try to answer some of these welfare outcome measures. But we don't currently know. And I just wanted to really quickly talk about welfare certifications, particularly for smaller growing, smaller farms. You may be selling at farmers markets, you may be selling at restaurants directly. This idea of welfare certifications may well come up. People might ask you about that. So when we talk about welfare certification, we're generally talking about third-party certifiers. So these are generally nonprofit companies that have created some set of standards. Typically, they're based off of scientific advisory committees. So they have people like us at Davis, welfare scientists who are on their committee boards, species specific, and they ask us, you know, can you review the literature on this particular topic and let us know what the consensus is for the best conditions right now. So I have here, they may be required. So these are actually volunteer groups. So a welfare certification company is not going to come to your farm and say, you must be certified by us. But you may actually be asked to become certified by whoever's purchasing your product. So if you're selling to a restaurant, the restaurant may say, hey, I want an assurance that you're following, that your animals are actually in welfare friendly conditions. Can you be certified by one of these companies? Same as at a farmer's market, consumers are becoming more savvy and more familiar with these labels, and they may ask you, hey, are you certified humane? Are you American Humane? Are you animal welfare approved? So who are they? They're nonprofit organizations. There are a lot of them out there. These are labels from 4 of the largest. So Certified Humane, Raised and Handled is the label for humane farm animal care. American Humane Certified is part of the American Humane Association. Animal Welfare Approved is a common one for pasture. So they only certify pasture-based operations. There are a number of small farms in Northern California that are pasture-based and animal welfare approved. And then if any of you shop at Whole Foods, you're probably familiar with this step system. It's the GAP certification, Global Animal Partnership. So you have all these choices. What's the difference? Not a lot. So if you go, they almost all have their standards publicly available on their websites, and the differences really come in what species they certify. So some are a bit more comprehensive than others in terms of what species they actually will certify. These all certify poultry, at least laying hens and broilers. Transparency is a little bit different between them. So some of them, you must pass every standard to be certified. Some of them, you're allowed a small fail rate. what you failed at is not transparent to the consumer themselves. So transparency may become a trust issue with your consumers who are buying from you. Pretty much all their standards are the same. Some of them will differ slightly. GAP is probably the most complicated because of their step system. So knowing where you fall within that and what you can achieve is a little bit different than the others. And do they help with consumer confusion? So I think a lot of producers think, okay, if I become certified by a third-party welfare organization, people will know, okay, I have this label, my product's good to go, I won't have any issues. That's not true. People are still very confused about these certification labels. And partly that's because there are so many of them. They are a business in and of themselves, so they do have competition amongst each other. And so some people will hear good things about certain labels, some people will hear bad things about certain labels, some people are just unsure, like, well, American Humane has done really good things with pets and children, so they must do good things with farm animals. I don't know what this other thing is, so they must not be that good. It doesn't really help with that confusion. You still, as a producer, have to really get out there and tell people, I have this certification because X, Y, and Z, and really educate them about what that means and why you made that choice. Okay, so I just had a little slide about resources available. Obviously, as Dr. Proteski pointed out, we're your extension specialists here in California. There aren't very many extension specialists across the country who sort of specialize in welfare, particularly for poultry. There's one at Purdue University. She's actually the only one I can think of at the moment. So certainly utilize us, get in touch with us. We're happy to talk with you, even if you have questions that you don't think necessarily fall within our area of expertise. Dr. Proteski and I shuttle email requests back and forth to each other all the time. We can look up answers for you. We can put you in touch with people who have much better information than we may. So please utilize our services. You have great things like this, this training course today and this series to give you some good information and get you started. Find out who your local county advisors are. We don't actually have any poultry related advisors in the state of California, but we have people who work on range, we have people who work on pasture, we have people who work on water management. So find out through your county, or you can get in touch with us and we can help you navigate that system, who these people are. We're all here, we're a giant network across the state to try to help any questions that you have. We can get you resources. We can come to you. I'm always happy to come, particularly if you're in Northern California. It's a little harder if you're in Southern California because we have limited travel funds. But happy if we can work it out to come and visit if you have a site-specific question. Oftentimes it helps us to really see the environment that the birds are in to give you a really good answer for some questions. If you have a group, maybe you have a small cooperative of pasture producers in your area, you know, I would be happy to come and give a talk to your group. That's part of what we do. You can request or sponsor, especially if you sponsor, but a workshop or something similar to today where maybe you have specific questions that you want answered that we can have experts, bring experts together and have them give you a really good rounded answer for that, give you face-to-face access to those people. And just remember that we're here to help you. You're our clientele and we want to give you whatever you need, whatever resources we can provide for you, we're here to do that. And that's all I have for you.
You want to do questions now? So are there, I think of people who can hear me, so people in the room can ask questions now, and if people want to use the chat box on Zoom, Dr. Kilman will repeat their questions. Any questions from anyone in the room for Dr. Blatchford?
I have a question about what if we try to grow the fast growing breed in a pressure condition?
Yeah, so the question is about raising the fast-growing broilers in a pasture system. You can do it. They don't tend to utilize pasture very well. I've seen some mixed results, I'll say. So I've been to some larger free-range operations where the birds were outside. Again, their yard had a lot of shade structures in it. There were some bushy kind of weeds there that you would see shake, and you knew there were birds underneath there. So they were utilizing some of that area, but it is really hard. Broilers tend not to really move around all that much anyway. So getting them to go outside with the idea that they're going to go outside and sort of roam around and forage, they're not really going to do that. Fast-growing birds aren't going to do that. That's just not part of their behavioral profile anymore. When they're younger, so up to about 3 weeks of age, they're fairly mobile. So they may utilize pasture a lot more at that point. But then you have issues of temperature, outside temperature, and things like that. They're also a little bit smaller, so they're easier for other things to eat, catch and eat. But once they're past 3 weeks of age, their activity level just drops pretty dramatically. And that's true whether they're inside or outside. So they're a little bit trickier. Feed you can use to try to entice them outside, but if you have feed also inside, they're likely to just stay inside and eat at those feeders. The slower growing strains tend to be much more mobile, and they do tend to utilize outdoor access much more. But again, they just take a lot longer to get to that heavier weight.
Yeah. Do you think the taste of the fast growing breeds will change if we raise it up in test pressure state?
I'm sorry, the taste?
Yeah.
So I don't really know. I can't give you a good answer. There have been a few taste test panels looking at slow versus fast growers, because there's also this idea that slow growing broilers are going to have a different taste profile. And most people ended up preferring the fast growing bird over the slow growing bird in that case. I guess it would really depend a little bit on what they're consuming on pasture. Again, they're not really out there foraging very much, so they're mostly eating just the feed that we provide for them. But I don't know if you've heard of any studies that have looked at taste of birds on pasture or not.
Not on pasture, but I know I've talked to a veterinarian for a very large commercial poultry company that we're all familiar with. It's multinational, and they know that taste is a real issue right now in some of the conventional breeds. And there's, I think, not a lot of, I think historically there hasn't been a lot of energy put into that because production was so kind of first and foremost, and now those companies are starting to pay a little more attention to that. Dr. Bland, do you have anything to add on that? Or?
It's a really good question, though.
Anyone else in the room have questions, comments, deep thoughts, not so deep thoughts? Dr. Tillman, anything online?
Nothing online.
Okay. What time are we starting the next talk, hypothetically, or do we want to take a short break? Okay, why don't we take a 5-minute break and we can get everything loaded for our next talk. So bathrooms are down the hall for people that are in the room.